Destroy Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli, and as you can see, not only is it very grim, bleak, and dreary in Budapest, but I have a cold, a very unpleasant cold, and but nonetheless, the gaggle must continue. So I will persevere for as long as I'm able. So thank you, everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate it. And of course, there are all sorts of things to discuss. I mean, today obviously is the anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, 24 years today. And I have to say, my view is that it's kind of an event that's come and gone and hasn't really had any lasting effect on American life. I don't see that America on 9/10 was very different from the America that we have today. Um, we know that um, the United States seized on the 9/11 attack. That was obvious that they would do that. They would seize on the 9/11 attacks to launch several wars. P. Durban says elderberry will lessen cold effects. Okay. I've never had elderberry. Well, thank you for that suggestion. Um, now, so Tesla Talk says, where were you on 9/11? Well, it's very odd because I wasn't living very far from 9/11. I was living on the Lower East Side, which is, I guess, about a couple of miles from 9/11. And I have to say, I slept through the whole thing. I mean, it's kind of early in the morning. I mean, it's only about 8 o'clock in the morning, so I'm usually not up at that hour. So I didn't hear anything. So, but by the time I got up, I had to look through all the messages, and I said, "Oh, this is so horrific. Everything's so terrible. Horror, horror, horror." I thought, "Oh, what happened?" And then so that's right. But I did go into work that day. Of course, there was no public transport that day. But luckily, the office I was working in wasn't too far from my home, so I did walk there. And those first kind of few days after 9/11, where it's a little like yes, this is sort of something special happens to you. Like it's um, like when you're a child, and then suddenly, for some reason, everybody's being very nice to you. Right? So it's like suddenly everyone comes to you, and everyone's heaping praise on you, and everybody's suddenly giving you presents. So everything was very, everyone went out of their way to um, uh, to. Uh, to be as considerate towards everyone else as possible. So New York really didn't seem like New York. I mean, it was just like, because suddenly everybody was very, very pleasant to everybody else, and and then of course we had all the uh, this little young girls would be sort of sitting there on a park bench and would suddenly start crying, and there's a lot of crying going on. Um, but my feeling was that I nothing really much changed. It was United States went to war against Iraq and against Afghanistan. Chances are, I'm not saying it would have happened or would not have happened, but there was always a good likelihood that the United States would go to war against Iraq and or Afghanistan with or without 9/11. If you recall, during the 1990s, when you had all those horrible people, those Project for the New American Century, all those Bill Kristol types and Robert Kagan, And throughout the 1990s, following Gulf War One, there was this the drumbeat for a war against Saddam Hussein. So that was there could never be any peace in in the Middle East as long as Saddam Hussein remained in power. It's one of those eternal themes from the Israel lobby that that somehow um, that if we could only get rid of this or that person, only get rid of him, then there will be peace in the Middle East. So, and those who are older will remember that the bugaboo of the 1960s was Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser. If as long as Nasser is in power in Egypt, there can never be peace in the Middle East. And then, of course, we had all the others. And as long as Gaddafi is there can never be any peace. As long as Arafat is there can never be any peace. And then, of course, as long as Saddam Hussein is there can never be any peace. Now, of course, it's, as long as Hamas is there can never be any peace. So this is a familiar trope of Israeli propaganda, and I thought that once George W. Bush won that election in 2000, and he brought in all these neoconservatives, some of whom were associated with the project of the new century, New American Century, project for the New American Century. That they're going to go after Saddam Hussein, with or without 9/11. Afghanistan was a kind of a separate issue. I didn't think they would go after Afghanistan because I always thought that Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset, and that there was really no reason particularly to go after Osama bin Laden, and they didn't. I think that was just simply an afterthought after 9/11. But the real agenda was to go after Saddam Hussein, and so they did that. So I see Steve Gainan has presented some articles there about the Israel Israel 9/11 connection. I've always been skeptical about that whole story of Israel and 9/11. First of all, it assumed that Israeli intelligence is so extraordinary, fantastic, and that they're always on the case and they're always following this or that lead, and so on. So I automatically made me skeptical. The other thing is that Israel has never really had a problem with jihadis. That would somehow, the fact that the Israelis were tracking these people in the United States, I didn't see why they would do that. Israel has never had a problem with jihadis. Israel has always had a problem with the secular nationalists. The jihadis are someone who actually work very comfortably with Israel, and as we've seen, that Hamas was an Israeli creation. They kind of grew out, got out of its control, and then of course, we saw what happened in Syria, where Israel supported ISIS, explicitly supported ISIS. So I didn't really think I didn't think that the story of the Israel and 9/11 really was terribly convincing, because I just don't think that Israel really had any particular incentive to follow these 9/11 would-be hijackers. So yeah, there seem to be some people celebrating. Okay, They were celebrating. Probably they thought that, hey, now the United States will realize what we in Israel are up against, how we have to deal with terrorists every day, and now we're going to get unconditional support from the United States. That doesn't really mean that I think Israel was involved in 9/11. I think it just gives too much credence to their amazing successfulness. The fact is that they're actually not particularly good. Israeli intelligence hasn't been, or at least it has a very mixed record. It often has got a lot of things wrong, kills all the wrong people. So I was never very convinced by that thesis. Um, I think the most plausible explanation was that these jihadis, and particularly Bin Laden, um, went out of control. They were no longer under the control of the U.S. They were created by the U.S. as a very useful weapon to be used um, against Russia, obviously, in the Caucasus, to be used against the various secular regimes in the Middle East. That's a long-standing policy that the Americans took over from the British. Support the clerics, the fanatical clerics against the secular leaders, and then and then they got a twist to it, which was the Caucasus, which they thought would be a really useful to weaken Russia there. And then, of course, in the case of Yugoslavia, Al Qaeda was very useful in the war in Bosnia and in the war in Kosovo. So they made use of Al Qaeda there. But, as often happens, they lost control. And for whatever reason, Bin Laden grew increasingly dissatisfied with his masters, and launched this thing. Now, that's I mean that was a kind of somewhat oversimplified. I don't know whether Bin Laden himself um, was involved in this. I mean, maybe not. Um, but I think this was a jihadi operation, and what the United States then did was turn this into a campaign against, yes, you would have guessed, secular nationalist regimes in the Middle East, which has always been the main target of U.S. attacks. So they used the jihadis to go after Saddam Hussein, who hated the jihadis. He had nothing to do with 9/11. He put jihadis in prison or tortured them. He didn't want anything. But they went after Saddam Hussein. And then, of course, the Americans went after Gaddafi, also a secular nationalist, also hated the jihadis. And then, of course, they went after Bashar al-Assad, also hated the jihadis. So you see the pattern here. And so that's why, as I said, I don't think 9/11 changed anything. I mean, it's kind of come and gone, and every September 11th we have this commemoration. But everything was kind of remained the same. The United States still aligned itself with jihadis. Remember, it was aligned with jihadis long after 9/11. It was long after when what's his name, Jake Sullivan, wrote to Hillary Clinton and said to her, "Well, Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria." So it was that was it. Al Qaeda is on our side. We're on the side of Al Qaeda to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. So you had this thing in 9/11, and then lo and behold, you're going after the secular nationalists. So I see Marty's joined us, and Marty has posted this picture of from December 1988. This is Reagan, Bush, and Gorbachev. And so this is December. So this is after the 1988 presidential election, which George H.W. Bush won very handily. It was actually a Republican landslide, and so you can see in that picture, he's looking very happy, looking in a very good mood. Reagan, obviously, you can see even in this picture, is clearly fading, and then Gorbachev is looking happy. Now, the I mean, there's several things that occur to me when I see that picture, which is, I mean, in December 1988, Gorbachev probably thought that he would survive. He would somehow survive his glasnost and perestroika. He would change all these institutions, and somehow he would ride out the storm. Um, and things only began to deteriorate for him in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that was still way ahead. And then Bush was looking very happy because he had won this election. I mean, it was a landslide, and it was really the last Republican landslide. The Republicans have won elections since 1988, presidential elections since 1988, but they've always been close ones, including Trump's 2024 victory. They were close elections. Um, but Bush won that very, very convincingly. And it was also the last time that the Republicans carried the state of California, which used to be this Republican stronghold, um, well, since forever, and then now it's become a Democratic stronghold. So Bush is looking very happy there, and then he kind of turned out to be a kind of rather um, ineffective president. And he was ineffective not because he was incompetent. He was actually quite a competent president, but he was ineffective because he really didn't stand for anything. He just didn't have any particular views on anything. There's a limit to how far you can go just being a kind of a pragmatist. You still have to have some core principles, some core beliefs. I mean, Nixon was a pragmatist, but Nixon had some core principles, core beliefs. He hated liberals. And I think that animated Nixon, and people loved Nixon for his hatred of liberals. But Bush didn't really hate liberals. In fact, Bush quite liked liberals. He kind of found it quite comfortable to be with them. He didn't much like conservatives. Um, he wasn't particularly comfortable with them. So almost from the start of his administration, Bush began sinking in the polls. He would have these the week of women, the week of education. In other words, he was allowing liberals and the New York Times to set the agenda for his administration. He then had a brief recovery following the first Gulf War, when superficially it looked like he was a shoe-in for 1992. But he wasn't going to win in 1992 because people really didn't like him. He was very waspy. He had no leadership qualities. He had no ability at all to address the people. He started floundering around, trying to sound conservative, trying to sound like a man of the people, and it always was fake. It always sounded fake. And so, as 1992 came around and the recession, quite a mild recession, but nonetheless a recession hit, he began sinking in the polls. It really was like a rock; it just kept sinking in the polls. And however inadequate Bill Clinton came across, because Bill Clinton was just obviously there was just so many problems with him, with all his women, the bimbo eruptions and his obvious lies about his his relationships with women, and his his essentially draft dodging, which is also a problem for him. And despite all of that, Clinton maintained a steady lead uh, throughout 1992, and that was really what Clinton did. Kind of blazed the trail for Donald Trump. So it doesn't really matter all these different all the you can drag out all these scandals, um, but that's the public doesn't really care very much about your moral fiber, um, and and so, but that was it. It was just simply because essentially the public decided we're not going to vote for a Sunday school teacher as president. We just don't care. We don't care about his morality and so on, which was, I mean, I guess Reagan started it, because Reagan, I think, was the first president who had been divorced. I mean, that was still, unthinkable for a president to be divorced. He was divorced, became president, and but then it was Clinton, and then he was, obviously a thoroughly disreputable character, um, but it didn't hurt him at all. Now, Robert says the wimp label didn't help Bush either. I guess not. I mean, that of all the um, labels, it was really kind of very unfair. I mean, he wasn't really a wimp. I mean, he had served in World War II. He had volunteered to serve. He almost was killed. His plane was shot down. So he was certainly no wimp. His problem was his manner. Um, it was a kind of waspy awkwardness and fakery. He was trying to be something that he's not, and people pick up on that. If you're trying to be something you're not, and I think that's what hurt him. Um, but I remember the wimp thing was definitely the. I remember that in during the 1988 campaign, there was, I think, Time magazine had that on its cover, the wimp factor. So yeah, that was, that they really got to him. And Al Haig, in one of the debates with Bush, said, I can't remember, something about, we had these fights in the administration, and can't remember what the issue was. And Haig turned to Bush and said that I didn't hear a wimp out of you. So um, but I mean, what worked for him in '88 wasn't going to work for him in '92, because in '88 he he was really riding out on Reagan's coattails. I mean, it was essentially Reagan, very very popular in '88, and Reagan would certainly have been reelected, and therefore, essentially, the popularity of Reagan was transferred to Bush. He wasn't. He really wasn't deserved. Um, but nonetheless, it was, since people didn't have they couldn't vote for Reagan, who had become a beloved figure. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. I mean, he had been a very controversial figure back in the 1960s and 70s, and now by 1988 he'd become this beloved old grandpa. And then he went to Bush. But Bush, almost immediately after he became president, I think even in his um, inaugural address, which is January the 20th, 1989, he talked about a kinder, gentler America. And I think Nancy Reagan kind of picked up on that. And she kind of turned to somebody and says, kinder and gentler than what? She took it as he was taking a swipe at Reagan. That his patron, he was taking a swipe at Reagan, which I think he was. Um, so in that picture, Bush and Gorbachev both look very happy, but it wasn't to last for very long. I mean, they by 1992, they kind of both, came to a very dismal end. Um, Gorbachev basically tossed away the Soviet Union. Just amazing, just see how he did that. And then Bush was a kind of a one-term president. I mean, he was just basically um, couldn't get reelected. I mean, when you think of so many presidents are at least able to get reelected, he wasn't able to get reelected. Um, anyway, but just to finish up on 9/11, um, I don't think the world changed in the slightest. I think the United States continued pursuing the foreign policy it's always been pursuing, a little bit more aggressive, but maybe not. As I say, I don't know what Bush and Cheney would have done in the absence of 9/11. I think they would have probably gone after Saddam Hussein anyway. um, and so I think that it didn't. And so where we are, um, when nothing changes. I mean, there's always a lot of talk about this is world changing and so on. Oh, 9/11 was a world changing event, and then you think about it. Well, what changed? I don't think anything changed. I knew exactly on 9/11 what would happen next. I knew what was going to happen. I'd say the United States is going to go and wage war against someone. It was just a matter of deciding whom were they going to target. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't on the first day. It wasn't immediate obvious that we'd go after Saddam Hussein. I thought maybe they might go after the Palestinians. Maybe they might go after Gaddafi. But they chose Saddam Hussein. So I don't think anything really very much changed um, on 9/11. So it's just every single year on September the 11th we go through this ritual, but it means increasingly less and less. I mean, I don't know what I don't think what it means to anyone today. Um, so there's that. Now, the other thing I guess is the case of uh, the assassination yesterday of Charlie Kirk. I don't have anything very much to add to it. In that, what happens? I mean, we at this stage we don't know exactly where who was behind this and the motivation. So we're having a little bit of um, revealed, which and has not been confirmed, that there's some of the cartridges that they'd found have inscriptions about uh, with transgender issues and Antifa issues, but I don't think that's been confirmed yet. I mean, it's been reported on Fox News, but we just don't know. So that's that aspect. Now, the other thing is that, I mean, obviously it's very tragic when a young man um, is killed. Um, However, as with, I was listening to some podcasts yesterday, and people were saying this is JFK, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy assassination. This will be of historic significance, historic, earth-shattering significance, in the United States. In years to come, people will remember where they were when they heard that Charlie Kirk had been shot. Now, right away, I thought, no, I don't think so. I would think, and I'm sorry to say, that in about a month's time, nobody's going to be talking about it. I think it'll be essentially ancient history. We'll be on to the next thing, whatever the next thing is. We'll be talking about the next thing, Israel and Iran, Trump, Putin, um, the and so that was now there have been stories presented by some that Israel was behind the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, I have to say, I'm very, very skeptical of this, and I don't know how people can make that assertion when we don't even know who killed him. I mean, no one's been arrested, and we don't know anything about who killed him. So I don't know how we can declare, oh, well, it was Israel behind it. Now, it is true that Charlie Kirk, that Charlie Kirk did express some skepticism about Israel first, that America has to embrace Israel's agenda. And he did express some frustration, anger about the coming war against Iran. And so Charlie Kirk, that's Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Steve Bannon all said, oh, well, we can't go around fighting wars on behalf of Israel. We should not go to war against Iran on behalf of Israel. And so that was the view of Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And we did a few podcasts on that. However, once Trump did that, Trump joined Israel in that attack on Iran, lo and behold, Charlie Kirk withdrew his objections. And he said, this is fantastic. Trump is the peacemaker. Because according to his logic, Trump didn't go in for regime change. It was a very limited attack. And so therefore, Trump is to be congratulated. And then this is, Trump is the peacemaker. Give the man a Nobel Peace Prize already. That's what Charlie Kirk wrote after the attack. So the least one can say is that he didn't offer any real resistance to Israel, to the influence of Israel on the Trump administration. He went along and said, "Oh yeah, I'm down for this. Give the man a Nobel Peace Prize." Now, and then after a while, he said, "Well, I'm not going to go around criticizing or second guessing the administration. I trust what they're doing. I trust that they are pursuing peace." So that was it. He didn't offer any real resistance to the influence of Israel, and any real resistance to America first becoming Israel first. So then I have to ask, well, so what would be the motivation for Israel to come after Charlie Kirk? The problem arises is that this is the sort of the go-to response when anything happens, that somehow Israel is behind this. And I'm happy to believe, if the evidence warrants it. But the trouble is that people just jump to this and say, "Oh, Israel was behind this." There's no evidence for it. And I don't even understand what would be the motivation, because Charlie Kirk was a very influential conservative figure, and by and large, he wasn't straying from the reservation. And if he were straying from the reservation, let's say he started straying from the reservation, there's an easy solution. You get onto Charlie Kirk, and you tell him, stop straying from the reservation. Get with the program already. Assassination, that's a very difficult thing to pull off, and not and definitely not a wise course of action. So I just don't see it. I mean, you'd have to present a much stronger case that that Israel was behind this, because um, by and large, with the exception of Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, these big kind of MAGA opponents of Israel have turned out to be duds. I mean, there's a lot of bluster on Bannon. I mean, I don't know if, whoever listens to Bannon, I mean, he goes blah blah blah. A lot of bluster, a lot of talk. Um, you try and figure out what the hell he's saying. I mean, it's like he, uh, uh, you just sort of wonder where he's really going, and I think that's the case. I think that's true of Bannon. I think it was true of Charlie Kirk. They're hedging their bets. So they've got something for both sides. Sometimes it seems like he's pissed off with Bibi. How dare Bibi not follow Trump's orders? And then next day he's blasting the mullahs, the horrible mullahs of Iran, or the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar is the Muslim Brotherhood. So and then you get confused. So is bombing Qatar a good thing because it's good to hit the Muslim Brotherhood, or it's a bad thing because Qatar did this without clearing it with Trump? And then same with Iran. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? That is it that with hitting Iran, or is the problem that just he doesn't like Trump, his hero Trump, looking like a wimp, in front of Netanyahu? So I basically, I'm not convinced that they are principled opposition. I think it's different in the case of Tucker Carlson. I think Tucker Carlson, has come out quite strongly against Israel, and he's taken a lot of flack for it. I think Marjorie Taylor has come out quite strongly against Israel, taken a lot of flack. So if you're going to conduct assassinations, I think, though, Tucker and Marjorie Taylor Greene would be more more likely candidates, because I think they are causing problems for Israel on the right. If that's the issue, if the issue is that Israel is losing support on the right, then then I think Tucker Carlson would be a more likely target, and same with Marjorie Taylor Greene. So that's just my view. I mean, the other thing is, I guess, as I said, I think it's tragic. Somebody so young getting killed. He probably had a big career ahead of him. I mean, he's handsome, he's charismatic, he's likable. Nice young family. And I'm sure a big political career beckoned. He would probably be running for Senate or governor at some point. So I think it's sad that that it was cut short. On the other hand, I don't see him as anything other than a as a very effective organizer. I think he was definitely knew how to organize those things that he created, those Turning Point USA conferences, they were very big deals. I mean, that took some doing to organize one of those. These trips around the country, that takes some doing. Um, and so I'd have to admire him for that. But I don't see that he had anything particularly new or insightful to say. I mean, I think it's just a um, um, TMTB says, I think you're discounting Kirk's money and organizations' influence supporting candidates. No, I'm not discounting that. I think that's fine. I think he did all that. But I listened a few times to his show, and in no time at all, I was bored out of my mind because he just didn't have anything terribly exciting to say. He was just somebody he's an organizer. I mean, that's basically that's what he does. Um, and I'd have to say that every generation, springs up its Charlie Kirks. So maybe I mean, there were kind of Charlie Kirk-like figures during the rise of Ronald Reagan. Charlie Kirk figures who were part of the Gingrich Revolution. Everyone's already forgotten about the Gingrich Revolution. Gingrich also kind of revolutionized everything. And suddenly we had all these activists, excited activists everywhere. That's all been kind of forgotten. So now we have this. This is Charlie Kirk. Plus a touch of populism that he added to it. But as I say, on that issue of Israel, he really dropped the ball. He didn't pursue it. It looked very interesting and very exciting. That he was going to go after Israel and so on, but then lo and behold, he supported Trump's bombing of Iran. So that and then the other thing I just want to mention is Peter Mandelson and his firing as U.S. ambassador, or rather UK ambassador to the United States. The interesting thing about Mandelson is, of course, that he a very, very devious character, very smart, but a very devious character. And he really created Tony Blair. I mean, Blair is his project. New Labour was his project. And that whole Cool Britannia and everything else. So he was a master of public relations. And he delivered for Blair with that huge victory in 1997. But then he himself got embroiled in one scandal after another. So there was a scandal about he's getting a interest-free loan from a cabinet member who was supposedly under investigation by his Department of Trade. And so that was a little embarrassing. He had to resign over that. But then he came back because Blair liked him. So he came back. And then in no time at all, he got himself involved in another scandal, this time over passports. He was basically interfering in the issuance of passports. And so he resigned over that. But then he continued, make a lot of money and had a nice post-governmental career despite this sleaziness of his activities. And then I was very surprised that he was appointed the ambassador to the United States, just because I mean, if you already have these scandals behind you, chances are you're going to come unstuck very quickly. So, it was, I thought, what was it, 6, 7 months before Mandelson again unraveled. I mean, so the wonder of it is that he lasted 6 or 7 months. So in this case, he came unstuck. It's each time it's a kind of a different issue. Mostly I guess it's money. He likes people. He likes people with money, and I guess that's why he hung out with Jeffrey Epstein. Um, and but you know, for Blair, I'm not Blair, Starmer, to complain that Mandelson lied to him. Mandelson hadn't really disclosed to Starmer the extent of his relationship with Epstein. Well, of course, Mandelson lied to you. What did you expect? Of course, he didn't really reveal, the extent of his relationship. Um, and and what was funny was that he, up until yesterday, Mandelson still thought that he could survive. I think he gave an interview. I think it was to the Sun, and he still seemed to think that he could survive. I mean, despite all of this mounting hysteria over Jeffrey Epstein, and everything has now already been exposed, with his contribution to that 50th birthday party, 50th birthday gift. Um, so I thought but this the last straw was these emails between Mandelson and Epstein, in which Mandelson um, was saying, "Hey, I thoroughly support you. You're being railroaded. You're the subject of injustice, and injustice is being perpetrated against you." So, um, so, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Mandelson. But nothing will happen with him. He'll go on making an awful lot of money, and that's it. It's quite extraordinary that despite the scandal-ridden career, he, he just continues. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments on our locals board. These are the people who are the members of our community, the ones who keep the dogs fed, trained, happy, and so really appreciate the people who contribute to the local sport. So Danaki says, "Dear George, setting aside Charlie Kirk's killing, which will just be used to further divide Americans and maybe impose further restrictions on rights, were you in New York on this day in 2001? If yes, what do you recall of it all? Where were you when the planes hit? Did you go to the site, etc.?" So I think I already talked about this. I kind of slept through it. So when I woke up and I just checked the messages, and the people the um, then told me, "Oh, this is so horrible." I did on that first day. I did try to go to the site, and the police hadn't yet put up, the all the barriers that they were subsequently to put up, and so I managed to get quite far down in Lower Manhattan. So I was still able to get reasonably close to the to the site. But after that, it was no longer possible. After day one, pretty much the entirety of Lower Manhattan was just simply closed off, and nobody could get there. I do think though that they didn't really disclose the extent of the poisoned air in Manhattan. I mean, as a result of this destroyed buildings, and the burning, because the buildings continued to burn underground, or the rubble that just continued burning, and so the pollution was quite horrible. I mean, the smell in the city for months was quite awful. And they said, oh, nothing to worry about. But I suffered as a result of that. I mean, I lost my voice for a couple of months. Just simply, I couldn't speak. And so I go to the doctor and say, what am I going to do? And I said, oh, well, I don't know. See if it comes back. And it didn't come back. I couldn't speak above a whisper. Um, and nobody ever said, "Hey, I think it's a consequence of this of the pollution, of the terrible air in Manhattan." Um, but gradually, I got my voice back. But I think that people were suffering all kinds of um, ill health effects as a result of this. Essentially, this burning, this massive burning buildings underground, and the smoke just continued to come out from this rubble. Um, and Yeah, so but in terms of the aftermath, I pretty much predicted what would happen. The United States would go to war against somebody or other. They would pick a fight over with somebody or other who had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, and they would use it in order to, clobber an American adversary, and they did it with Saddam Hussein. So everything, all the plans were already set. They've been busy working on this during the 1990s. That project for the new American century. They've been busy building all this up, and and so it was just they were ready to go. But that's why I'm saying that I don't think anything changed as a result. I think it's just, that's kind of what you would expect would happen. And so that I mean, 2000 by September 2001, Milosevic had been overthrown um, a year earlier. Yeah, so he was overthrown October 2000. If he hadn't been, if Milosevic was still in charge in Belgrade, he would have probably been blamed for 9/11, and the Americans would probably have gone after Milosevic and overthrown him, because he was the mastermind behind 9/11. Anyway, thank you, Danaki. And then Robert, thank you very much. Thank you, appreciate your generosity. Robert says, I remember right after 9/11 seeing tables stacked with Iqbal Ahmad confronting empire alongside Chomsky and Said. Bookstores are highlighted his sharp analysis of US empire and political violence as a guide for readers seeing context behind the attacks. In addition to destroying the World Trade Towers, I think 9/11 forever destroyed the official narrative, such as they hate our freedom and values. Well, what makes you think that this was destroyed? I don't think it was destroyed. I think 9/11 reinforced it in a massive way. And the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was full of this ridiculous triumphalism, from the likes of Andrew Sullivan, and I remember, Andrew Sullivan and Ben Stein, and they're saying, well, these horrible Islamists, they don't really, they have no appreciation of freedom. They have no appreciation of our sexual freedom. They don't appreciate our liberation of women, our liberation of gays. This is what we are about. This is, that this is our civilization, and they're just primitive. They're in the Dark Ages. And so there was a lot of the sort of excitement. Yeah, well, they hate us because we provide education for women, because we give women freedom, because we grant women equality, and we don't persecute gays. There was an awful lot of talk like that, and that's why they attacked the United States, because they saw in the United States the sort of the embodiment of freedom and free sexuality and all these kind of wonderful things. Um, so I mean, Chomsky. I mean, he obviously took that line that somehow that there's always a kind of a, a disconnect between when somebody does something to the United States. There's no attempt to wonder, well, why did they do it? What drove these people to do this? So it has to be based on some kind of envy of the United States, but nothing about, well, what did the United States do to them? That could this be just a retaliation for what the United States did? And particularly as this is what Bin Laden himself said at the time, that this is retaliation for everything that you did to us, and particularly everything that Israel, whom you enable, did to us. So that was so Chomsky made that argument, but then Chomsky also made the argument that the, the extent of the casualties or damage the United States sustained on 9/11 pales into insignificance with the casualties and damage that the United States inflicts on others. So he cited a few examples, such as the attack on Sudan, I think it was 1998, and then the attacks on Iraq, the sanctions against Iraq, which had been going on, for 10 years. And then, of course, everything the United States did in Indochina. He said, well, if you just look at the sheer numbers of how many people were killed relative to the population, then it's just 9/11 is just a drop in the ocean in comparison with the extent of the damage that the United States inflicts on others. For that, he got attacked in a way that Chomsky had never really been attacked before. I mean, he really it was a huge tirade. How dare Chomsky defend or justify the 9/11 terrorists? He, of course, wasn't justifying them. He was just saying, well, um, you have to then see the world through their eyes, and see, how they see the United States and what the United States has done to them and to their countries. And then you have to see, well, if you just look at numbers and the casualties, I mean, the casualties here just pales in comparison with the casualties that the United States regularly inflicts on others. And so Chomsky was really attacked. You had all these awful people like that horrible Andrew Sullivan, who I don't know, he called Chomsky kind of a living in his ivory tower, making a huge amount of money, and so on. So, but that was he was really very much an kind of isolated figure. I mean, he obviously had huge standing, and so he could withstand all these personal attacks. But it's very important to emphasize that there was an enormous consensus on behalf of going to war against Iraq. I mean, it's overwhelming. Left and right, center, everybody was in favor of going to war against Iraq. Now, of course, people pretend, oh well, oh, I was against it, it was blah blah blah. But it's just untrue. Everybody was in favor of this war against Iraq. No one really cared very much about the evidence and the lack of any evidence linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11, the lack of evidence that Saddam Hussein had was well, I mean, he may have had weapons of mass destruction. There was no evidence that he was close to having nuclear weapons, which is what people always thought of when you say weapons of mass destruction. Oh, he has nuclear weapons. There was none of that. So that, but everyone thought that oh, it's justified because he's such a terrible leader, and so there were people who were in favor of going after Saddam Hussein because he's involved in 9/11. Then you had the humanitarian intervention crowd. They were in favor of it because Saddam Hussein is such a terrible leader, and he did all these terrible things against the Kurds or Iran or whatever. So there was something for everyone. Everyone had a reason to go after it, and above all, everyone thought this would be very easy. It would be very easy to defeat Saddam Hussein. And so when you have a project that you think, hey, we're on the side of good, we're on the side of the angels, and happily, it should be pretty easy. We should be able to knock Saddam Hussein over pretty quickly. Then everyone's on board, and so there was almost no dissent from that consensus to go after Saddam Hussein. And I knew this would happen. I knew at the time nothing is going to stop this. This is going to happen. The fact that the UN Security Council wasn't going to support it didn't matter. That even France was against it didn't matter. Germany was against it didn't matter. It was going to happen. The Americans were going to push for this. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. So, so then, Cynthia, always good to see you, Cynthia. And so Cynthia says that she's now talking about Nepal, about the events in Nepal. And Cynthia says, recall that Cookies Newland visited Nepal 2 years ago in order to pressure Nepal into choosing between US and China. So what is now going on in Nepal could very well be a regime change operation led by the US, and a very successful operation at that, since US relations with India are clearly beginning to thaw a bit. And if these relations totally thaw, will it put a stop to the $6 billion highway being built between China and India, which involves going through Nepal? Well, I tend to agree with you. I do think that what's happening in Nepal is a color revolution, and clearly they want to make sure that Nepal is prized away from China. Um, the, whether that's going to succeed, it seems to I mean I think that's a difficult one to do. Now, the evidence for its being a color revolution, I think, is pretty clear. You can hear it from the kind of language that's being used. They're talking about corruption, a kind of fairly nebulous term. They're talking about the young people, and then it's all about the social media. So I think it all smacks of a color revolution. Yeah, I mean, I think that's almost certainly what they're trying to do here. The Americans are sort of being relatively quiet about all of this, but that doesn't really prove anything. They nearly always are quiet whenever there's a color revolution taking place. They don't want any kind of gloating. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, they want to prize Nepal away from China. Um, the I mean, the thing with India is a when you say relations with India are beginning to thaw a bit. Um, it's true. I mean, Trump sent out a truth today saying we're negotiating a trade agreement, and and the Modi seemed to send out a friendly tweet about that he's negotiating well with Trump, and I think that's that I think is uh, important. I think they will come to some kind of an agreement. However, India isn't just going to lie down and just simply return to the U.S. fold. I mean, it's. I mean, they saw what the United States does. I mean, just essentially, the United States picked a fight with India over something that really has nothing to do with anything to do between U.S. and India. And I mean the issue of India's buying oil from Russia. I mean, why shouldn't India buy oil from Russia? I mean, when Trump was uh, complaining about relations between the U.S. and India, he was raising a reasonable argument, which was, hey, India maintains these huge tariffs against the United States, and so that this is clearly unfair. India has one of the largest tariffs in the world, and it's in the U.S. interest to remove these tariffs. That's a reasonable position to take. I think that's what a U.S. president should do, and I think India was perfectly receptive to discussing that. But then Trump segued into something very different. He suddenly started attacking India, and particularly Peter Navarro did this. They started attacking India for importing oil from Russia. Well, that seems to be a very, very different case, because India is perfectly entitled to import its oil from wherever. It's nothing to do with the United States where India gets its oil from. Unless Trump wants to elevate the Ukraine issue above everything else, but he hasn't done it on anything else. In fact, he's kind of put Ukraine kind of on the back burner. So now he suddenly raises this, that he's so horrified and indignant that India is funding the Russian war machine, when Trump himself has said that he doesn't want to take any sanctions against Russia. So this is obviously hypocritical, and it obviously pisses India off, because this has nothing to do with any issues of tariffs between the United States and India. And so that's why I think there's a limit to how far any rapprochement between U.S. and India can go, because I think India will not forget this attack on this particular issue of Russian oil imports. So that's all. So basically, yes, I think there is a color revolution taking place in Nepal. I think the United States would like a regime change in Nepal. I think they would like an anti-China regime in Nepal. But I think the China-India relationship now is pretty solidly set. I don't think India is going to get join the United States in fueling bad relations with China. I mean, India and China, they have their disputes over the border, but that's minor stuff. They're not going to go to war over the over border. I mean, they're both big countries. They've got plenty of territory. They don't need additional territory. Um, but the idea that that India cannot trade with whomever it wants, that I think cuts to the fore. That's something that India would regard as a serious violation of its sovereignty, and therefore that's coming from the United States, not coming from China. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. That's very, very interesting. And anyway, Robert says here, um, to better understand Charlie Kirk, it's helpful to contrast him with Murray Rothbard. Huh. Okay. Kirk backed low taxes and markets, but wanted a strong nation state to enforce borders, tariffs, and cultural norms. Rothbard, the anarcho capitalist, wanted to abolish the state entirely. No Fed, no tariffs, no moral laws, leaving defense and justice to voluntary markets. Both opposed big government spending, but Kirk is nationalist populist, while Rothbard is a radical stateless libertarian. I think that's a fair. I did. I thought I didn't realize that Rothbard was quite as radical as you described him. So that the nose Rothbard really embraced the most radical kind of libertarian position. I mean, like Hayek also embraced that kind of position, which was, we really don't need we don't need governments. Obviously, we don't need judges. We don't need armies and police. All that can be sorted out privately. On markets can deal with all of that. Um, so that's the radical libertarian thing, which is that we don't really need governments at all. Um, I agree. I think that Charlie Kirk did, yes, he talked about the nation state to enforce borders. Um, my one hesitation about that is that I just don't know whether how strongly Charlie Kirk really believed all of this. I mean, I just he's very young, so really he emerges as a figure on the scene during the past 10 years. So everything we know about Charlie Kirk is what he has done in the past 10 years. And those are the 10 years of Donald Trump's ascendancy. So Trump was the one who kind of defined conservatism as the nation state, espousing the values of the nation state, strong borders, national interest, suspicion of any kind of international obligations, international institutions. And so Charlie Kirk really worked within that framework, because that's the framework that was set by the leader of the Republican Party. The and the reason I'm kind of suspicious about Kirk was precisely that he made this dramatic comment about this war against Iran. He said, "We're not going to wage this war against America first. No forever wars. No wars for Israel." And so he said that. He said, "Well, that's the new kind of conservatism, this nationalist populist conservatism that is now become dominant within the Republican Party." But then he seemed to abandon that, and he abandoned it by accepting a completely phony, ridiculous argument that because Trump had ended the U.S. military involvement in Iran with attacking those nuclear facilities. And he said, right, that's it. We're bringing this to an end. We're not going to do regime change in Tehran. But because he, Trump made that argument, so somehow Charlie Kirk kind of whipped this up into, oh, well, this is Trumpism. This nationalist, populist conservatism. Yeah, that's fine. Trump is the peace. Trump is the peace candidate. But of course, it was always ridiculous because that's just round one. Trump launched this attack on the nuclear facilities. Okay, he ended it. Ended it for good? What makes you think? How can you be sure that he's just ended it for good? I mean, he may well be moving forward to do it again. I mean, I think it's quite likely he's going to do it again because Netanyahu wants to do it again. And so America could well do it again. So when Charlie Kirk just said, oh, yeah, Trump is the peace candidate, Trump is the peace president because he stopped with these attacks on the nuclear facilities, it showed kind of a certain lack of understanding. So my point is that he has embraced this kind of conservatism because that's the conservatism of the moment. That's the conservatism associated with Trump. But if Kirk were around, I don't know, 20 years ago in the sort of the Gingrich era, I kind of think that he would have, or 30 years ago, the Gingrich era, I would think he would be embracing the Gingrich style of conservatism. But there's no question, I do think that this whole nation state conservatism enforcing borders, you have to deal then with the Israel problem because you can't embrace nation state America first conservatism and unconditional support for Israel. And what's really happening now is these very slimy Israel supporters. This is this. What's it called? It's called the national conservatism. And I talked about it before. This Hazoni, very slimy character. He's based in Israel, and he talks about this national conservatism, and all of that. Edmund Burke this, Edmund Burke that. All of it is about how to get this populist conservatism, how to get it absolutely solidly right behind Israel. And so that's why when one talks about, oh yeah, nation state, enforcing borders, tariffs, and cultural norms, okay, fantastic. What's your take on Israel? Because if you don't address that issue, then your conservatism is just going to be completely meaningless. You're not in any way addressing what's in America's interest. You are addressing what's in Israel's interest. And Charlie Kirk, very quickly learned his lesson from that. So that's that's my view of him. So I just felt, obviously it's very bad. It's horrible, what happened. But he kind of, he had an opportunity, I think, to take a stand, but he knew which side his bread was buttered on. He was making a lot of money. Through this Turning Points USA, and I think he realized, if I want to go on making a lot of money here, I better get with the program with Israel. Anyway, thank you, Robert. And now Dale Owens, good to see you again, Dale. Dale says, George, what do you think of Reform UK? Will they one day form a government? Are they too libertarian? What do you think? Well, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously, Reform UK is riding high in the polls right now and comfortably ahead. Um, the What I think is working for Reform UK, I mean, in a very superficial way, is the personality of Farage. I mean, basically, this very dreary, colorless figure of Starmer and this hopeless, buffoonish Kemi Badenoch. Um, Farage kind of looks like, comes across as a throwback to a more cheerful, happier UK. I mean, he's just, somebody kind of people remember, hey, this was what the UK was like decades ago. It was producing people like Nigel Farage. So he has that going for him, his personality. He also has going for him the issue of immigration. And that's really really taken off in Europe, but also in the UK. Starmer has no idea how to handle this. Is clueless on that. So that's working for reform. What I think is the problem for reform is, whether people really, for all Farage's undoubted appeal, do people trust him? And I have to say, I'm very skeptical about him. Um, he, this business of immigration. Now his signature issue, and yet he makes everything about this business of Britain's membership of the European Court of Human Rights. I said, oh, well, we can't do anything on immigration until we withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. But that's a lot of nonsense. And the fact that he keeps talking about this suggests that he isn't really very serious about doing anything. He's not going to. He's not somebody who is going to take a brave, very unpopular position and fight for it. That's just, he doesn't come across as doing it, and that's why he seems to take this cop out. Well, we can't really do anything on immigration until we withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. But withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights is going to be a very difficult endeavor. I mean, this is, it'll be another Brexit. So if he becomes prime minister and he says, well, we're going to begin the process of withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights, that's going to take up all of his time as prime minister. All of his time. He's going to be, it's going to be like Brexit. It's going to get, there'll be constant fights on that. And what is going to happen is that the liberals, the sort of the liberal political culture in the UK, will seize on that debate, just as they did on Brexit, to say, well, if Britain withdraws from the European Court of Human Rights, then torture is going to come back, backstreet abortions, racism is going to run rampant. Once again, landladies are going to put notices on their homes, no blacks, no coloreds. I think it was, no coloreds. All these horrible things. We're going to be dragged into a world of 100 years ago if we leave the European Court of Human Rights. That's what they're going to do. That's going to be the debate. The European Court of Human Rights is what stands between a civilized society today and we go back to the sort of Victorian era. That's not a debate I think Farage will want to have. And the fact is, you don't need the European Court of Human Rights to start, to start throwing out, illegal immigrants. Absolutely, you can do it. Look, Greece is doing it. Greece is preventing migrants from entering the country. That is a violation of EU human rights law. EU human rights law is everyone is entitled to come and make an application for asylum. And basically, Greece has said, no, not only is no one coming to Greece, and any boats with loaded with migrants, we're just going to push them to Turkey. Greece has done this. So basically, they're just pushing away. And indeed NGOs, any NGOs that are helping illegal migrants to land in Greece will be prosecuted. So in any attempt to land, boats landing with illegal migrants will be prosecuted, and we're not going to have them. We're just going to push them back into Turkey, North Africa, wherever. Greece has done all that while it's a member of the European Court of Human Rights. So it means that you can do it. It doesn't matter what the European Court of Human Rights says. So the fact that Farage has made this into this big issue, we can't really do anything about migration until we withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights, it sounds like he's looking for an excuse not to do anything. And I think that's what I feel about Farage. He's looking for an excuse not to do anything. So I think there's a good chance he's going to do well in the next election. I don't know if he's going to win. It's a really tall order to get 300 MPs elected. I mean, that's a really hard thing to do. But so I don't know if he can pull that off. But he can do very well. And once he does very well, then he's going to be in a position to dictate terms, into forming a coalition government. I guess with the Tories, but there's still going to be the problems, which is, hey, are you really now willing to do something that's going to be very unpopular? Very unpopular. You start pushing boats back. You're going to have to do that. Push the boats back to France. France isn't going to like it, but you're going to have to do that. Push them, or wherever. Just push them back. And start removing people from the country. Anyone who's in the country illegal has to be just removed. Those are tough decisions. And so far, Starmer hasn't been able to do it. The Tories, before Starmer, they weren't able to do it. And I have my doubts that Farage will be able to do it. But, he may surprise us. But I'm a little skeptical of him. But I think that's really the big issue. I mean, all the rest about his economic policies, I think that's secondary. He's got immigration is going to be his big issue. Anyway, thank you so much, Dale. And then Robert says, in the latest news from New Jersey, I wonder if Chris Christie, your friend Chris Christie, I wonder if he's going to run for president again. I mean, he's not that old. He could absolutely. This would be his. I guess this would be his third attempt at the presidency. But these professional politician types, they don't have anything else in their lives, so it's quite possible that they'll just they're going to run again. What else is he going to do? There's nothing much else. So he's going to run a third time for president, and he'll fail a third time. But there's nothing else to do. Anyway, Robert says, in the latest news from New Jersey, Menendez's better half just pulled a sentence about half that of Bob's, 4.5 years versus Bob's 11. Huh. Well, that's interesting. Pulled a about half that of Menendez's better half. Bob got 11 years. Well, yes, that's not bad. So does that mean that he's going to have to start? Can he get out of it? Does he have to start serving his sentence right away, or does he have any grounds left to to continue with his appeals. I mean, he can still appeal his conviction, or you know. So in other words, can he avoid beginning the sentence right away? Anyway, R. Brown, 1958, says the majority of MAGA is against the war in Ukraine. Yes, there's also a significant and growing component in MAGA that rejects blind allegiance to the political state of Israel. Yes, I think that's true. I don't discount that. But there's also people like Kirk who are making they're very rich. I mean, they made a lot of money. This Turning Point USA, they made a lot of money, and surrounding him are a lot of Israel firsters. You know, they've had big money. Hazoni is one of the people around him. Kirk was at that conference run by Hazoni. This Hazoni is just such a creep. But Charlie Kirk spoke at that recent conference by Hazoni. So if you're making that kind of money, this Turning Point USA, and you got all these big political figures who all show up. This isn't just MAGA, the people who show up to Turning Point USA. You know, you've got Ted Cruz shows up. Lindsey Graham shows up. This is a very much the frontline mainstream GOP. They're part of this whole vast Turning Point USA apparat. It's not just MAGA who go to this. So when you're in that position, you have to think about money. You have to think about you got to keep. You want to keep making money. You want to enjoy the lifestyle that you're enjoying. So you have to be very careful. When it comes to how far you can go with criticizing Israel, and we can see he very quickly walked back his comments. Anyway, so blind allegiance to the political state of Israel. The real test will be the types of MAGA candidates that primary the Rhino APAC incumbents that have for too long rubber stamped every Israeli policy action. Far easier said than done when unlimited campaign money is at stake. I absolutely agree with you. I think it's we haven't yet seen a real success on the part of those who attack the Israel firsters. Now, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think she's very popular. She has her supporters, and I think she's okay. She's safe. But look, Thomas Massey. We'll see what happens with Thomas Massey. He's going to have a tough fight on his hands. So that we've yet to see whether the America firsters versus the Israel firsters, what happens when the big bucks really start making themselves felt. Will MAGA cave when it comes to Israel? And the truth is, MAGA, when it comes to Israel, are kind of all over the place. I think they haven't quite figured out what they really think about it. When Ukraine, absolutely, they know exactly what to think about Ukraine, and they're unambiguous in their opposition. But when it comes to Israel, they're very easily succumb to saying, "Well, Israel is our greatest ally in the world. Israel is a democracy, like the way United States is. Israel is a great friend. We can't go against Israel. Israel first and America first. They're synonyms. I mean, there's no so they can easily succumb to that kind of thinking. That's why, unfortunately, they haven't yet thought this through sufficiently. Now, it's changing. I mean, if you look at these Twitter threads by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then you've got Tucker Carlson, so things are changing among among MAGA. I don't know whether it's fast enough for 2026, but they are. But it is changing, and they're having influence. But at the moment, it's still Israel and America are joined at the hip, and so it's very hard for for MAGA to abandon Israel so far. But we'll see. And again, just in terms of the money involved, I mean, you can just conjure up a candidate out of nowhere, absolutely nowhere. But he comes with huge amounts of APAC money, and then boom, you don't have a chance. I mean, this creep, this I always forget his name, that very fat guy in Florida who barely scraped through in Florida, but he managed to get the GOP nomination. Uh, I forgot his name. The complete shill for Israel. Total propagandist. He's the one who said that Palestinians need to go on a diet. Um, and so he came out of nowhere. So that's the thing. You can just invent candidates out of nothing, so long as they're well funded. So we'll see whether MAGA is able to make this really challenge the Israel firsters. As I said, I think Charlie Kirk. I think he failed the test. So, anyway, thank you so much, R. Brown. Dale says, "What do you think of John Charmley? I discovered the other week that he passed away earlier this year. I think highly of Charmley. I like his books. I didn't know that he died. I mean, so yeah. Um, I'm not even sure how old he was. I always assumed he was quite young. Um, I mean, not young, but I didn't think he was particularly old. Um, I didn't. Yeah, that's interesting. But in terms of his books, I think he was one of the kind of important writers in the 1990s in rehabilitating Neville Chamberlain and contrary-wise to demote uh, Churchill. His view. I mean, he's a kind of a nationalist conservative, and he believed that Chamberlain in the late 1930s believed that you have to. Britain needs to maintain its empire. We are a rich but vulnerable empire, because that's the condition for British prosperity, and that the only way Britain can maintain its empire is by avoiding a war. Chamberlain absolutely consistently believed this, um, as opposed to Churchill, who wanted to go to war. But Churchill was completely irresponsible in doing so because Britain really had no means to fight this war. Chamberlain knew this, that Britain doesn't have the means to fight a war against Germany. I mean, it's just an absurdity. How can Britain fight a war with Germany? Britain doesn't have a continental army. Um, so Churchill could only fight this war by bringing the United States in. He was a sort of the Zelensky of his day. He'd bring the United States in. But if the United States was going to come in, and this is something Chamberlain, I think, saw, if the United States was going to come in, then Britain would have to pay a price. Britain would have to liquidate its empire, liquidate its assets, and surrender its power and influence in the world to the United States. So that would be that's the price that Britain would have to pay to get the United States in. And Churchill, according to Chamberlain, was willing to pay that price. Chamberlain wasn't. Chamberlain thought this was a terrible idea. And in that book, I've forgotten the name of the book by Charmley, he has this picture of Churchill and Chamberlain sitting together. I think they're having breakfast or something like that. And the caption was "the two appeasers," and that was the thing. It was kind of a joke. The two appeasers. Chamberlain, wanted to appease Germany. Churchill, he wants to appease the United States. Um, so I thought Chalmers' perspective was very good. It's very refreshing. I think Chamberlain has been ridiculously maligned, particularly in the United States. The way it's always an insult to be called a Chamberlain, whereas in fact Chamberlain was exactly the kind of statesman you want at the head of your government. You want somebody who's saying, "I'm not going to do anything that weakens this country. I want this country to remain strong, and therefore I'm going to avoid a war. That's the only way I can maintain a strong country. Avoid a war. If I go into a war, we're going to lose our power. We're going to lose our money." And that's exactly what happened. Anyway, thank you, Dale. I didn't know that about Chumley. And the Lost Peace, I think that Dale owns. Okay, so look, Bridgegate, Bridgegate. Yeah, I like that picture of. Anyway, and then Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for your contribution, and above all, thank you so much for all of your contributions here at the Gaggle. As I always say, Anne Marie is a very distinguished musician, played in some of the finest orchestras in the world, the finest conductors and composers of the last few decades. And so therefore, when she contributes with her commentary on music and her insights, I mean, we're all very, very fortunate. And she's recently written something really interesting about Martinu, the Czech composer who was featured in the Gaggle Music Club. And Marie made some very good, strong criticisms of Martinu, and I really appreciate that. I responded rather ineffectually, but nonetheless, I responded vaguely defending Martinu. But the point is that we're really very fortunate to have a distinguished musician among us to provide us with this kinds of knowledgeable and informative commentary. So thank you, Anne Marie. So Dale says he was 69. That's John Chalmers. So young by today's standards. That's definitely young, huh? So Dale then says Chalmers was Richard Evans' bête noire. Number 2, and number 1, of course, was David Irving. Yes, I think so. I think Evans, of course, wrote that I don't know how one would call it. I mean, I guess it's a presentation about Irving in that trial, the Holocaust denial trial, and but it was a very unfair. I mean, if you read that lengthy essay Evans wrote about Irving, very, very unfair. It was the whole thing was just done in order to smear Irving. He just, in other words, every single thing that he could think of that was negative, he would shove in about Irving. But I think much more highly of Chalmers than of Evans, and as I say, just you kind of discredit yourself when you write something like that about Irving. I mean, Irving had his problems, but what Evans did for the court, for that Deborah Lipstadt court, I mean, he was paid very well. It was the Lipstadt legal team paid him a lot of money to write that hatchet job on Irving. But if you do something like that, you kind of you undermine your credibility. So Dale says The Lost Peace. I think that's the book. Well, Chalmers wrote a number of books. I think that's probably the book with Churchill and Chamberlain. But good book and readable, so he was a real historian. And then R. Brown, says the U.S. special relationship with the U.K. has been a one-way deal for 125 years. Yep. World War One was a war of European egos. Yes. Wilson put the U.S. in to push his globalist ideal, cost the U.S. 300,000 casualties in the summer of 1918. The defeat of Germany led to the rise of National Socialism and Hitler and World War II. More dead Americans. The UK is still at it with Ukraine. We need a complete break from the UK, which is great at manipulation, intrigue, not so good at anything else. I absolutely agree with you. That's absolutely right. The U.S. intervention in 1918 was a total disaster, because if it hadn't been for that, I think the war would have concluded um, as a kind of a tie. Um, because Germany couldn't really make any further headway. Britain and France couldn't really make any headway, and so they would have probably worked out some sort of a reasonable deal. I mean, there were all sorts of reasonable deals being worked out among the Allied powers during the years 1916 and 17. What put an end to these negotiations was Wilson's decision to get involved in the war, because once the United States got in, then the Allied powers could just push forward for a complete victory. And I think there was never any reason why they should win. I think they didn't deserve to win, but they got it because suddenly they had this this limitless flow of manpower, which the United States provided. And that's what secured them their victory over Germany. And it was catastrophic. I mean, it was absolute catastrophe for Germany. Total collapse within Germany, and then of course all the bitterness and resentment about the deal, which was unfair on Germany. So absolutely, there was no reason for the United States to get in other than through Wilson's globalist imperial ambitions. Luckily, the Republicans kind of put an end to that. They said we're not going to take any further part in it, and so there was a reaction against Wilson that took place in America. That was the good America, the good, strong America of the 1920s. Didn't last long. We had all the dishonesty of FDR. So, and FDR and Wilson both lied to the American people, since both FDR and Wilson promised that they weren't going to get involved in this war. No, we're not going to get involved in this war. After we're going to stay out of this war. So they had to lie because the Americans just didn't want to get involved in either war. So it was a real catastrophe. Anyway, R. Brown says World War II would have ended the way all prior Europeans voted: some cash, some border adjustments, no massive humiliation. Hitler would have had no footing. I agree. I agree. And that's right. There was no need for that whole escalation, which is what once the British decided to wage all-out war against Germany for no discernible reason. It wasn't clear. You don't like Hitler. Okay, you don't like Hitler. No, but I think it's true as well about World War One and World War Two. But even World War Two, once you decide that you're going to wage this all-out war against Germany, then Germany is going to also wage an all-out war, and therefore suddenly the scale of the casualties becomes exponentially greater. That was, so it was still a limited war up until sort of 1940 and 41. But now, once this was a massively escalated exercise, then the scale of the casualties, the scale of these battles grew. Since Britain, I mean, imagine in 1940, there was an opportunity to end that war. Britain could have ended that war, and Britain wouldn't have suffered in any consequence at all. After the fall of France, there could have been a deal made, which Hitler offered a deal to Britain. That's it. Basically, end the war now. Britain refused to take that deal. And then once Britain refused to take the deal, then Hitler had to readjust his plans, because he knew Britain is determined to go on fighting this war, and he had to. So Hitler also had to go on fighting that war. Anyway, it's a big subject. We can talk about it another time. So my time is Gribble report says Germany decided to escalate the war with Barbarossa. That's true, but why did they do Barbarossa? I mean, they did Barbarossa because ultimately Hitler was now facing the possibility that within a few years he was going to face a two-front war. Two-front war. Because the Soviet Union was growing stronger and stronger, it's industrializing, and Britain was also growing stronger and stronger. So eventually, since Britain was determined to go on fighting this war, he had to somehow break up the formula. And if he could defeat so that's his thinking. If he could defeat the Soviet Union quickly and easily, then Britain would have no hope of prevailing against Germany. Anyway, it's a big subject. We can talk about it next time. So thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you very much for all your comments and questions. So really appreciate it. So now just got Hitler wrote a whole book about how Russia needed to be invaded. He didn't really write about that. That's not what didn't quite say that. But in any case, what you say in your kind of programmatic book, Mein Kampf, has nothing to do with what the reality was. The reality was Hitler had a rather good working relationship with the Soviet Union. So, from 1939 to 41, everything was kind of working quite smoothly between Germany and the Soviet Union. So something changed. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments. And we will be back next Tuesday for my solo. Monday, we're going to have the joint live stream with Peter. Until then, thank you. Good night. All the best. Bye-bye.